Hello and welcome to this edition of New Humanum. My guest today is Lord Farmer, Michael Farmer, who in a long life has had many incarnations: a successful metals trader in the city, the founder of a hedge fund. At one time he was treasurer of the Tory party. But since his 30s, throughout it all, he's been a firm Christian. And when we sat down, he told me about those formative values which made him the man he is. Lord Farmer, thanks very much for agreeing to do this interview for New Humanum. You've had a very varied career looking at it on paper. I wonder what you would consider, from your vantage point now, in your eighth decade, what would you consider to have been the formative part of your career? Which was the most important from your point of view?
Well, thank you, Robin, anyway, for your welcome. Childhood is always formative. I mean, that's where you either learn rights and wrongs or you don't, and what is good and bad. The immediate answer that comes to my mind is my 30s, at which point I became what I would describe as a born-again Christian. But of course, my childhood, which was fairly chaotic, with alcoholism in the background, my father dying when I was 4 and from falling over when he was drunk, and my mother being an alcoholic, we descended from being reasonably well off to bankrupt, and so my sister and I were brought up in a home which was chaotic and unhappy, really, and I did have a Christian aunt who was, by and large, rather ridiculed by the rest of the family. She'd been a missionary, leper colonies in Nepal and Kenya. So I had this background of that childhood, and my sister, I ended up, I was at a prep school in New Forest, but in the end we went bust. So I ended up in the state, in a boarding house at a state grammar school, which was a very stabilizing place for relationships. My sister didn't. She was older than me, and she was very talented at speaking elocution, but she was pretty and she was an actress, but she was vulnerable. I mean, she was very vulnerable. So in those days, in the 50s, early 50s, of course, we look back and see the abuse. I mean, certainly we suffer from poverty, neglect and shame, but I think shame is a very big thing, I think, in a childhood. It's huge. But my sister was also abused, which I wasn't really aware of. I was younger than her until a bit later on, and that really gave her a miserable life, really miserable. I mean, she attempted quite serious suicide attempts 3 times before she was 20, and in those days that was she was shamed because of it. You know, when she was in hospital, having taken a big overdose and that sort of thing, you know, there was the criticism, why are you using up a hospital bed when somebody who's genuinely ill should be there, that sort of thing. And so, I mean, she was certainly an influence. I mean, I was younger, what could I do? You know, but I did sort of feel that as the only male around, I probably should try and do something.
You felt that from an early age?
Yeah, well, the time it really hit me was when I was on holidays, when I was about 14, 15. And we were living in a sort of like a slum tenement in the middle of Maidenhead, actually. It's now a car park. And my mother and I were there, and my sister she was an actress. She was out on the road, sort of thing. And my mother was drunk, and in those days there were only, I think, 2 channels or something on the TV. We did have a TV, and she was just she was drunk. She got drunk very easily. She was quite fragile. She wasn't healthy, and she smoked a lot. Anyway, I was watching something, and she switched it over, and she wasn't really watching it. And in the end, I went up and switched it back again. And there were various sort of four-letter words coming my way, dirty little this and that and everything else. And I suddenly felt sorry for her. Instead of being angry or thinking I suddenly felt very sorry for her. And I thought, well, the best thing for you, my mother, is for you to go to bed. So I sort of picked her up, and she was slightly protesting. I mean, she was quite tall, she was 5'9" and a half. Picked her up and moved her across the room to the door, put her outside the door, closed the door, and put my foot against it. And there was a sort of banging and shouting and on the other side. And I said, go to bed, just go to bed, you'll be all right, So she went to bed. And in the morning, she didn't remember a thing about it. But I noticed from then on, there was a sort of slight change in the relationship, that she I think felt there was something, there was help.
Mm. What age were you at this point?
14 or 15, I suppose.
Right. So this is young manhood and taking responsibility, really, isn't it?
Well, there was no one else to.
No. And so, presumably because of your family circumstances, the responsibility came on you early. And was it burdensome, or did you feel equipped for it?
No, I didn't see it as a responsibility. It just was life as it was. I mean, because I hadn't got a father, and this comes back to why we do things then. I go on about fatherlessness, and because home was chaotic. I mean, even in a stable, good little boarding school like Wantage, the state boarding school, there's 60 boarders, 300 day boys. Nevertheless, I was wild. I mean, I was beaten a lot. I was beaten a lot at prep school. I was beaten a lot, and I can see that with young men who don't have that loving fatherly figure around, and you don't know what to do. So at school, I was called wild and things. So I was on the edge quite often, but so I never really saw it as a responsibility. I more saw it as loving my mother. I mean,
yes.
She was trying to bring us up under very difficult circumstances. She was going out to work. She'd been told she'd be dead in 5 years, but earlier, and she was still battling away. So, and then in the end, I think she sort of she stopped drinking really towards the end.
So you must have pondered a lot, I'm sure, the weakness people have for alcohol, and why do you think it was that your mother and your father both had that predilection? Was it? I mean, do you consider now alcoholism to be a sort of predetermined thing, or?
No, I don't. I think the war had a lot to do with it. I think my father, who had worked in the city, in fact, on the metal exchange, been very successful before the war, was a culture of boozy lunches. Mm-hmm. Sometimes he was a tin merchant. They were in touch with Penang in Malaya, so they had these breakfasts, but sometimes they were champagne breakfasts. So there was a lot of booze around it. So I think when he was young, in his 20s, but he was being quite successful, there was this culture of, have a boozy meal, and you're one of the boys. And I do feel there was quite a sort of bad influence on him then. He didn't have to. I think he was a reserved occupation, but he joined. He was the Royal Naval Reserve, and his brother was killed in a bomb in, I think, in Cardiff. And then he was injured, and he was he was invalided out. That's the reason I'm here, because I was born in '44. I think it was before. And even when I started work in the same company that he had been in, because they sort of felt, I think, a little bit guilty. I started work at £8 a week as a difference account clerk in A. Strauss and Company when I was 18. And there was a commissioner of arms, you know, these wonderful old people he was a sergeant, his name was Sergeant Simmons. And he was one of the chaps on the desk at the front. In those days, he used to take the post round Saturday mornings and things like this. And I was still quite wild in a way, you know, out with the lads drinking, goodness knows what else. And I think I came in one morning when I was about 21, pretty hungover. And Sergeant Simmons just sort of took me aside and he said, you know, Michael, stick to the beer. Avoid spirits, stick to the beer. Now that was just one sentence from somebody who was giving you friendly advice. And actually I thought, that makes sense. I know what my father was like, I know what my mother was like. So from then on, I just drank beer. And by the time I was 25, I had quite a nice little beer belly, actually. But I stopped drinking spirits and, you know.
Yes. Good advice, that
Oh,
was.
it was excellent.
Very good advice.
It was not only good advice, it was loving advice.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
I mean,
kindly meant.
Exactly, yeah.
Did you feel bitter about your parents' weaknesses, or did you come eventually to see it as human frailty? Did you forgive them, or was there any need for forgiveness?
I think I probably I did go, I mean, early on in life, I probably blamed my father. In fact, I probably blamed my father up to quite recently. But I've known the background, and I think as you get older, you get wiser, you see your own fallibilities and frailties. Yeah. And I've certainly come to see, you know, his good sides, etc. But that fragility of life, yes. You know, and you know, I very much as a Christian, you know, life is a struggle. I mean, actually, it says in Genesis 3, you know, because we have the knowledge of good and evil, you cannot live forever. And it says, life will be pain in childbirth, thorns and thistles, sweat of the brow, getting yes. the bread on the table every day. And at the end, you decay and return to the dust of the earth. And I sometimes give this talk in a school, and I go to Genesis 3, and I say, you know, I'm in the decaying bit. I'll soon be the dust, you know. And I say, but life's a struggle. And it's a struggle for me, and I say to the schoolboys, it's a struggle for all of you as well. And they all go, yeah, they all know.
I don't know about you, but I always find it very vexing when there are these judgments made on previous generations, and I think our parents' generation, I'm the same generation as you, or a little bit younger than you, but more or less the same generation. I hesitate to pass judgment on my parents' generation, who went through something exactly. which we have not known, thankfully, exactly. but I think was very hard for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
You know, the war was, you know, very tough and stressful, yeah. and perhaps your father was exposed to something which broke his spirit, certainly, yeah. perhaps.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, Robin. Today we don't understand what the war did to that generation, and it's when you look back, it's not just the end of the war. We talk about a period of austerity today. I mean, it's nothing like what went on for the 8 or 10 years after the war. Yes. With the debts we had, the ration books we had, that, you know, and not only that, the wounded coming back, the dead that weren't coming back, the broken families, the widows, the orphans, I mean, society, and we were one of the ones that was paying the debt back to the Americans. But,
Yes.
you know, so, I mean, it was a society trying to pull itself back onto its feet. And, you know, and so you might have had boarding school hardships, which you did, you know, but since then things have progressed, you know, a lot.
So there you were a young man just setting out on a career in the city. The metals exchange business, now that is an unfamiliar world to most of us. So what exactly is it that you did in that business? What exactly are you doing?
Well, I'm not doing it anymore, but...
No, back then.
No, then. Well, the metal exchange was... The city has many different exchanges. Stock exchange, it has the coffee exchange or the oil market. Historically, you know, London was the global city for markets. You know, this is built up from the Empire days. And the metal exchange, the London Metal Exchange, was the global pricing market for non-ferrous metals, base metals, copper, tin, lead, zinc, aluminium, nickel, those group of metals. And there was this ring of seats, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but red seats, about 30 seats, 35 seats were members' seats. And there was a big copper ashtray in the middle, because in the beginning it was all the partners. Some of the partners had their top hats on, smoking cigars and things like that. You used to sit in their seats, and when I was there, they had these what's called rings. So at 12 o'clock there would be the first ring. 5 minutes you would trade in copper, next 5 minutes tin, next lead, zinc, etc., etc. That would be called the first ring. Have a 5-minute break, and then you do the second ring, do the same again, except this ring, this shouting, the closing prices of that ring would be the official price for the day. So a Zambian producer and a Chinese consumer, for instance, would price their contracts on the average London Metal Exchange settlement price for May, for instance. So it was the pricing mechanism. So there's an awful lot of hedging going on, people selling futures, because you could trade, in the end, you can trade up to 15 months, but it was mainly cash, what we called, which is the next day or 2 days. Physical delivery, the metal exchange had its own warehouses. And that just gives you a rough idea.
Did you become a trader yourself? You were a trader?
Oh, very much so, yeah.
Did you like it?
Yes, I would say I did. I mean, it was a lot of adrenaline. I was put in the ring actually very early on, because Strauss sent me to Germany, and I worked in Germany at a company there, learnt German, and I was all for staying there actually, because they offered me a job. The chap back in London, when I came back to London, I said I'd like to go there. I was 21, I think. And he said, "Don't be so silly, go and sit at your desk." So I sat at my desk, and he said, "Well, what do you want?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to deal in the ring. I'd like to, instead of being clerk, actually deal in the ring." But in those days, it was the old partner, so it was very unusual to have a young person. But he put me in the ring, and I mean, it's pretty wild, and it's, you know, it can be a lot of money. You can lose quickly or make quickly. I mean, but I saw some extraordinary things going on. But I did well in the ring, and then I was a broker, acting on behalf of other people. They would give orders, so I wouldn't really be taking a risk myself. No. But at that point, I was asked to join another company, which was a merchanting trading company, which actually traded for itself. And I did join them. They were the sort of premier, dominant copper trader on the market. And that's when I learnt the physical business, shipping copper cathodes from Rotterdam to Shanghai, or, you know, from Antofagasta to, you know, New York or somewhere. You know, globally moving commodities around.
Very exciting and stimulating. What do you think is What is the main aptitude you need for a good trader? What was it that, I mean, you, obviously someone spotted you as a young man with talent for this kind of work. What was it about yourself, do you think, that made you a good trader?
I think you do need a sort of spirit of adventure, and you do need to be on the front foot. And I mean, for instance, at the end of the second ring, in this ring, everyone's trying to either move the price up or down. So you get a lot of shouting, and the shouting is, you know, if you're trying to push the price down, you're trying to sell over there to Brandeis Goldschmidt, and somebody else is trying to push the price up there. Your voice has basically got to be the incisive voice. So, in fact, I did this until I was 35. And at that point, I remember I had something slightly wrong. I was, you know, had a sort of croaky voice. And I went to see some chap in Harley Street, a chap called Sir Douglas Ranger, who was a very famous ENT chap. And he looked at me and he looked at my throat and everything. He said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I shout at people." And he said, "What do you mean shout?" And I explained to him. And then he started laughing. And I said, "Well, what's funny?" And he said, "Well, the only person I've ever seen with what you've got is a sergeant major who gave commands above gunfire." And I said, "Oh, right." I said, "Well, what do I do?" He said, "Well, you stop shouting." And so I then backed off from the ring, and actually a much better position is where you're dealing with the producers and the consumers and the rod producers, etc. Getting to know the industry worldwide, and that's what I did. So that's where I learnt that business.
By this stage, you were a family man already, so you were married?
I married at 30, so quite a long time. I never thought I could get married. I think because of my childhood, I thought I'm not a very reliable person for somebody to marry. Well, I really did sort of think, you know, you're making a lifelong commitment. It's a big deal, and I just didn't think I could keep it. You know, I did. I wasn't a Christian. My sort of motto was the Simon and Garfunkel song, you know, "I am a rock, I am an island," from the point of view that people hurt you, you don't want to let them near you. I mean, that was my background for philosophy when I was young, and that was because of childhood and everything else, really.
But you overcame that reluctance, fell in love presumably, and got married.
Yes, but I was reluctant a bit. I mean, I hesitate to put it on tape sort of thing, but I mean, my wife did say, "When are you going to ask me?" And I just said, "But you'll have to wait." And in the end I did, you know, because...
The city, you know, is very much the citadel of Mammon, isn't it? I mean, you know, it's a sort of... and I think those of us who have never been part of the city think of it as being as it were, the acme of materialism in a way. So how did your conversion to Christianity come about? It must have been... Was it a surprise to you? Was it a surprise to others? What happened?
Yep. It was a surprise to everybody. In fact, Freddie Wolf was the chairman of the Metal Exchange. When I had my 40th, became a Christian at 35. When I had my 40th, we had a little party where we lived out in Buckinghamshire, and he was there with a few other people, and he made a little speech, and he said something like, "Michael is not the same person as he was before," and something like that, which I will always remember, and it was just because I was a Christian. But I mean, I have told this story before, so it's not really confidential or anything, but you know, we lived in the country. We were a bit isolated. I didn't really have any family. I had a sister who was dependent on me by that time. My wife had been brought up. Her family was in the Far East, Singapore, so we were a bit by ourselves. But we were there for 5 years, and the first child was coming along, so that was one factor. So I kept thinking, goodness me, what's this? Who is this person? You know, who is this person? Who are they going to be? What, you know? And I just sort of thinking about that. Living in the country as well, in the middle of fields, the seasons I would cut the grass, we'd go for walks. We had a couple of dogs, and you know, and do the vegetable garden and that sort of thing. And you're just, if you're doing that at the weekends and things, you're surrounded by what is creation, but this providential creation. You've got the apples on the apple tree. You've got the wheat growing in the fields in the summer, and that sort of thing. You've got cattle and everything else, and you sort of think after a while, this is such an extraordinary place, such an extraordinary universe. It's so complex, absolutely extraordinarily beyond imagination, the complexity of it. If you think of how a tiny little flea can fly around, or you know, how the human brain is made up, and just the different, you know, forces. I mean, it's beyond, you could never think to the end of it. And so that's what theologians call general revelation was sort of pouring in on me the whole time. So that was there. And then we actually knew somebody, and we asked who was having a problem, and we asked our doctor how we could help them. And the doctor wasn't a Christian actually, but said, well, try and encourage them to mix with people who go to church. And I thought, when my wife said this to me, I thought, what? Why mix with people who go to church? And then I thought, they'll probably try and be helpful. They'll probably put an arm around them.
Actually, was this person unhappy, sort of depressed?
Yes. No, it was a depressive crisis they were going through.
Right.
Yeah, and so that was going on. Then, in fact, actually, our local vicar, who was 2 miles away, and we were in the country, we'd been there 5 years. Nobody ever knocked on our door. So, and all of a sudden, a knock on our door, and he just said, "My name's Nick Maloney, and I'm the local vicar, and just came to see how you are." And they would come in for a cup of tea, but he never mentioned God, and he never mentioned Jesus. So there were these sort of things going on in my life, and then it gets a bit, a little bit supernatural, if you like, because I used to, having been at boarding school, one had been to chapel, you know, one did know the Bible, but I wasn't a Christian. God didn't figure in my life at all. And then one night, I went to bed, we were in bed, and I went to sleep. And in the middle of the night, I just woke up and I heard Michael. And I just said, reaction, "Yes, Lord." And across here was, in white, "Jesus Christ is the Son of God." And I just thought, changes everything. This just changes everything. I've just got to come to grips with this, you know. What does it mean? You know, here, you know. And I thought, I better start going to this little church, and I better mix with Christians. I've got to learn, you know, I've got to read the Bible. Well, you know, I was sort of thinking like this. And I will say, if you like, the next word that came in, the last word, if you like, immediate, was when I thought to myself, I better start going to this little church along the road. It was only a little Anglican church. Was, don't let them make you treasurer, you need to learn. And actually, guess what? About 6 weeks later, after I'd started going there, they said, "Would you like to be treasurer?" But the interesting thing was, there was one chap there who worked in the city, and I was working in the city in Bishopsgate, and I was going to the sandwich bar for a sandwich every lunchtime. And I was just thinking about God the whole time, on the train, on the street, walking along, you know, reading, I was just thinking about God. The only place I didn't think about God was when I got up the lift into the office. And then I started thinking about money, actually. But I was thinking about God, and I was in the sandwich bar, and there was a mirror on the wall, and I saw this chap coming in, and I thought, I know you. And he sort of came in, hovered about, and then he went out again. And then the next day he came in again. And actually he'd come in to speak to me because he saw I was there, but he'd chickened out, if you like. But the next time he came up and he said, didn't you go to that little church? And I said, oh yeah, that's where I've seen you. And he said, did you know round the corner is this church that teaches the Bible for half an hour on a Tuesday lunchtime? And I said, no, I didn't. I said, but that's just what I want. And there it was, was St Helens Bishopsgate, which was a very, some people call it like a theological college, but it's biblical. And so that you just had faithful biblical, almost verse by verse teaching every Tuesday. I went in there and I made friends. I was a great American chap, and still he's been living here for years and years, and we're still together. We went to Romania together. We visited Baptist churches, and in the Ceausescu days, and did those sort of things together. But then I went there and I was being fed. Tuesday lunchtime I went to a Monday lunchtime little Bible study group. We had prayer meetings and everything else. I started growing, and learning about the Lord. And of course, the Bible says, you will never reach the end of understanding the love of God. It passes understanding, So which I think is wonderful, because for eternity you'll never get to the end of it. You always make new discoveries,
It must have been very disconcerting, this revelation that you had, this personal revelation. Did you try in any way to resist it?
No.
Because you didn't?
No. My wife did to begin with. When I sort of woke up, she said, I went to bed with, or Michael, and I woke up with this born-again Christian. and she was, in the beginning, she doesn't mind me saying it. There was one morning I was going to church. She stood in front of the car and said, "You're not going to church?" And I said, "Yes, I am." But I prayed, and Lord, could we be one for you? And, slowly, she realized that the Lord wasn't a threat. He was good and he was loving. And now we're a very strong team. In fact, in many ways, I think she's stronger than I am, prayerfully and, the work that she does.
There was, your mum and dad were not religious, but there was this aunt in the background you mentioned. Yeah. And was she a sort of, maybe she sort of played on your imagination a bit, did she maybe?
She gave me a Bible when I was a boy, and I always kept the Bible. It was a leather thing, Bible, and I just kept it. It was, I wasn't given that many things, but it was sort of precious to me, although I didn't read it. But it was in my bedroom. And inside she had written Psalm 119, verse 18, "Open my eyes that I may behold wonderful things in your law." She had written that. And I always used to read that and I think, what does that mean? I thought it was a funny thing to think, but it was just there. So, and I had actually gone, she had organised in the holidays when things were chaotic, that I'd gone to I think a scripture union camp once or twice. So I had that influence, but she was, as I said, rather ridiculed by the rest of the family, actually. Yeah. Well, Aunt Barbara was a sort of dry old stick, and she'd been a spinster, been a missionary. Yeah. But actually, when I became a Christian, because she lived in the upper Richmond Road there in a little flat, retired missionary, she didn't have much money, and I used to go round and have supper with her every now and then, because I was the only relation she had in London. She had other nephews and nieces all around, but I was the only one, and I used to go and see her. And then one supper we used to have, this is a Christian missionary's supper, was what are the leftovers in the fridge, sort of put on the table, but I didn't mind, I was a young bloke. And I thought, well, I'd better tell her, And I said, Aunt Barbara, I've become a Christian. And she her mouth dropped. And she said, I never thought it would be you. Because you've been praying for all the nephews and nieces.
Yes.
And I was almost like the runt of the litter, because all the other ones were sort of, but I was down there. And
Interesting.
yeah, it was lovely.
I always think, actually, I don't like to hear people disparaging the work of those old, those Christian missionaries who went out all over the empire.
Yeah.
I think that they must have planted the seeds of faith throughout the world, and the good they have done will never be known, actually.
Well, it'll be known in heaven.
Yes.
It will.
Yeah.
No, I entirely agree with you, Robin. I think that, you know, she worked in Kenya, she worked in Nepal, in these leper colonies, you know, quite tough times. All her life. I mean, she gave her life to the Lord in that, you know, it was tough.
And when you think of that and the sacrifice involved, then it's humbling,
Very
actually.
Yeah.
So, so how did your conversion to becoming a Christian, how did that impinge on your work in the metal exchange? I mean, did it make you? Well, I assume that you were honest anyway. But I mean, did the fact of becoming a Christian affect the way you did your job?
You've delicately put that question, I think. Just coming back to the honesty bit, and I'm talking generally here. I mean, I joined the city in 1963, and when I joined, I think by then the culture was still, my word is my bond.
Yes.
The city is, you know, it's the, you know, the god of mammon and, you know, and ambition, if you like, and it's what's generally happened is this culture, which was from Victorian days, I think, of trusting in somebody, actually has evaporated to relying on the law. So we now have the law, which tells you what you can and you can't do. And so what you'll have in the city, I mean, you've got an abundance of lawyers, because people are always pushing at the edges, just to see, is this allowed? Isn't? Well, we'll just try it over here, and then we'll have a legal fight about it as to how much money you can make. But the gods of the city, you know, I mean, it's something I learnt. It was difficult as a Christian. I realized there was this underlying imperative to make money. That was almost prime. Attached to that is whatever service you're giving in order to do it, or trading. Okay, so it, you know, I was going to church, you know, the sort of Bible studies and everything else, and I would ask myself as a trader, why was I doing this, you know, etc. And in fact, when I was 5 years a Christian, I went to the pastor in the church in the city, said to him, I think I should go to theological college and be a minister. And this is another one, somebody saying, don't be silly. And he just looked at me and said, don't be so silly, Michael. He said, if you're not the Christian in your office, who is? Yeah. And I went, oh, all right, okay. And so I went back, and it was a gradual thing. You don't do it immediately. There's courage, there's faith involved, there's prayer involved, there's, you know, studying the word. There's, you know, what I realized, I think I mentioned to you earlier, about not being ashamed of the Lord. I learnt very early on to tell people I'm a Christian. My maiden speech in Parliament, I'm a Christian. When I was actually working when I was in charge of base metals they were appointing me to be in charge of base metals for this global trading company. It was headquarters in New York. It was by and large a Jewish company. And they said, would I head up on this committee, you know, copper and other base metals. And I thought, before I answered, this was a bit later on, I thought, I'll sleep on it, pray about it. And in the middle of the night, I woke up and I thought, I have to tell him I'm a Christian, because this was the chairman of the company. And so the next morning I said, Marty, you know, I'm prepared to do this, but you need to know I'm a Christian. And I said, therefore, there are more important things to me than the company and making money. There is God, there is my family, and then there's the work. And I will work hard. But I said, if you're prepared to accept me on those terms, then I'm prepared to do it. And well, they were anyway. But I've always said to other people in the city, other Christians, put your head above the parapet. The Lord will be with you there. If you keep it underneath the parapet, he's not there. You're ashamed of him. So
did you meet with hostility?
Sort of subterranean hostility, I think. Yeah, there's quite a lot of companies. Funnily enough, I worked for Enron. I mean, I was in charge of theirs. But they bought my company a year and a half before they went bust. And I had a little Mark study group I used to teach Mark for many years from late 80s. And I had a little different Mark study group, various businessmen join it. There'd be about 7 or 8 people. We'll go through Mark's Gospel, the earliest Gospel, and the big questions is, who is Jesus and why did he come? And they're lovely studies. So I was doing this Mark study at Enron, and I asked them, I said, I'm doing it Tuesday lunchtime or whatever it was, a little group of us. And I remember the HR department said, are you being coercive? And I thought, ooh. I said, I don't think so. I think I'm just, it's just, if people want to come along, they can come along,
Yes. Yes, but people were maybe a little suspicious. And,
a lot of companies don't like it.
Yeah.
I mean, because the city, the gods are mammon, it's money, it's a corporate ladder, it's the company itself. What does a company do? It gives you the money for your home, it gives you your pension, it gives you your health insurance, it gives you your holidays, basically, your bonus. It's your whole reason for living.
Yeah.
It's very easy to bow down to these gods, and that was what I learned early on. You don't bow down to these gods. Yeah. And as Christians, we bow down to the Lord, and we learn to say no. And that was a big thing, just to say no to this company. Have these company weekends in Los Angeles or something, and I just say, well, I don't do that. There's no point in me being there. Yeah. And they learnt that, and it never hurt your career. You think it does by saying no, but it doesn't. Well, sometimes it does. I think sometimes these days it's a bit tougher.
Because I would imagine, as an outsider, that your ethical standards, your ethical rules might put you sometimes in conflict with what the company, your colleagues wanted you to do, because you might have to forego a juicy deal because of, was that a real thing?
But I was, by that time, by and large, when I became a Christian, I was already
quite senior. I
was a senior trader in the company I was in then, and then thereafter, so I could say which trades we did and which trades we didn't. Yeah. But even so, those lines are quite foggy sometimes. But for instance, trading with the Chinese, in those days, we'd do a deal with the Chinese, selling them some copper. It would be priced on the metal exchange, and then you get this, telex in those days or something that's saying, please invoice us at sort of £20 a tonne higher, and could you, the balance will be paid into this account, something like that.
Interesting.
And I just said, we don't do that. And in fact, most of my big competitors, there was corruption. In fact, the corruption is now being seen. And in fact, in the last few years, it's come from being undercover to overcover. There is justice departments, investigations into various companies, but the corruption in Africa, in you know the Stans, when you're dealing with mining companies, etc. But my little rule was, we trust the Lord, and you know you'll either prosper or not, but in any event, it's up to the Lord, and just it's much better to be. You sleep well at night, etc. I mean, I know some trader who made a lot of money, lots of money, and when he realised investigations were taking place, he's having to move everything about, he's having to move everything out, etc., etc. I mean, he's living a nightmare.
I noticed the other week, actually, there was a report from that charity, Transparency International, which measures corruption in various countries. And I noticed that we, that is the UK, had dropped a number of places, significant number of places actually, in the time since they did the last survey. And it's a measure, I don't know how accurate, of corruption in public life. I wonder if you, if you think that's probably true from your point of view. Do you think that we have standards in the country in terms of ethical standards and probity? These have dropped in the last few decades?
Yes, and probably dropping right at this minute in time, actually. And it's to do with the walking away from the Lord. It's to do with the retreat from Christianity, and the culture has changed. You know, the whole sort of Victorian culture. And it's interesting, there was a book, I think, by Professor Christy Davis, was it? But there he had this U-curve of deviance in it, which was based on absolute data from sort of 1850 to 1900 and beyond into the 20th century. And the U-curve of deviance showed that during the period 1850 to 1900, the sort of level of criminality, it was dropping quite a lot. And the sort of data that was being shown was that the average age of prisoners was going up. So, you know, you weren't getting so many young people coming in. And one of the areas they attributed this to was the proliferation of Sunday schools. Mm-hmm. All right, and then in around 1900, the intelligentsia, if you like, or the people who know, started referring to prisoners or to criminals as victims themselves, you know, and there was this sort of culture that started developing as to explaining away why people should have been criminal. And there was a flattening out of this deviance from sort of 1900 to 1950, 1960. And it was at that point that it started going back up again. And it's been going up ever since.
Steeply.
And that is because you no longer have Sunday schools. You talk to children today and young people, so many of them, you have no idea what Christianity is. You know, so you've got this ignorance, whereas before you had the Sunday schools, you had RE or whatever it was in school, which taught you the basic Christian history, if you like. But now no longer do you have that, except in a few places.
And this is also something which is there are very few Christian homes these days. I mean, the thing is that Christianity is best nurtured in a family situation, isn't it? Yeah. And the level of family breakdown in the UK now is really at crisis levels. I find it. I know actually from having prepped for this for this interview that this is a particular interest of yours, which is one of the reasons I'm bringing it up. But it has long been my conviction that the root cause of many of the ills that we suffer in our society is because families have become so broken and unstable, and so many young people grow up without fathers.
Yeah. Well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, you touched on a lot of things there, but fundamentally the culture has changed, as I mentioned, from a culture which had the Christian ethic behind it. There was a God. The way to behave is to love your neighbour, is to try and forgive your enemy, etc. And try and serve in the community, try to do good and give life. There was this ethic coming from a faith. That was a national faith. You see it in the coronation service, Look at the faithfulness of the Queen that we had. She promised that she would serve till, I think she should be called Queen Elizabeth the Faithful.
Yes.
I think that's because she was faithful to her promises to God, to us, and to her family.
Yes.
And she was a miracle. I thank the Lord that I lived through her reign. She's a classic example. But during that reign, of course, we've had the culture, which there's a book called the Triumph and Rise of the Modern Self, which is a sort of Me Too culture. It's looking at me. It's looking at the individual. It's a culture. You can call it expressive liberalism, liberal individualism. You can use all these words, but those words sum it up. It's about me, and it's liberal. So fundamentally, do whatever you like, with whomever you like. Just don't hurt anybody. All right, that's it. Except it doesn't work. No. Because you do hurt people, and you hurt yourself apart from anything else. I mean, we were looking at some stats the other day. At some university, they couldn't believe the research that came out from that. It came out to the conclusion we are now the loneliest generation that's ever existed. People living by themselves, and you're getting the children living in their bedrooms. All they have is their smartphone or something. Whereas the Christian was look out. Look at. Can I help? Yeah. We didn't always do it, but we knew that it was a good thing to do, and it's still there a little bit. I mean, I think the pendulum is swinging back, and it is. We have to fight it, and we have to. Christians in Parliament or Christians in any walk of life, in the media, everywhere, we have to keep highlighting what is worthwhile in life, what makes life valuable, those committed relationships. I put it down to a family is somewhere where you've got committed relationships. All right, we say blood is thicker than water, fine. Okay, so you could say they're joined by blood. It's not money, it's a fact, that you can even be a distant cousin and think, oh, right, he's a distant cousin. But certainly families, brothers, sisters, mother, father, grannies, or whatever, those are lifetime committed relationships without any price attached to them, all right? And that's why funnily enough, when my parliamentary advisor, Samantha Callan, Dr. Callan, and I were going around departments of government saying, how can you strengthen families? How can you, we were pushing forward the whole concept of family hubs, which thankfully now the government is implementing. But we got to the Ministry of Justice, and the prison minister said, oh, well, it's interesting. He said, we've just got this data that shows prisoners who receive family visits are 39% less likely to reoffend than those who don't have them. And then he said, well, would you like to do a review on how to strengthen prisoners' family relationships? So we said, it was a bit of a tussle, we said, we'll do it if it's a government review. Anyway, they did it. We did it, and I must give a lot of credit to Dr. Callan, because she's an academic, and I mean, what am I? You know, I left school at 18. I couldn't do that sort of stuff. But and we had a lot of help from, you know, ex-convicts, prison governors, prison officers, civil servants, the lawyers, or charity members, or everything. They were all advising. And in the end, we made, I think, getting on with nearly 25 recommendations. We worked within the parameters of what the government could do. All right, it was very important. And in the end, they accepted the review and are implementing every single one. And then they asked me to do a review for the female estate, which we did, and they're doing that as well. So it's funny that in a captive audience, in the MOJ, there's a recognition there that these committed relationships are what's really valuable. And that's what we need to, you know, push out into the other government departments. But of course, the committed relationships come from Christianity. What does God say? He says, love me and love your neighbor as yourself. It's all to do with, and he's fully committed to us. He's committed to us through the cross. We live in grace, not by works. I mean, I'm not a good person. I'm just a Christian person. You know, I believe in the Lord. And so life is about relationships. And the committed ones work. I mean, even little events like Sergeant Simmons, for instance, can, you know, I mean, but I always remember the government's social care advisor, was a Scotsman, and he was a wild man. He'd been in care homes all around Scotland when he was young. And he was in one, and I think he was probably, I don't know, 11, 12, 13, something like that. And he smashed the place up one day. And so then he was called to see a chap who's in charge of a care home. So he got his black plastic bag and he put his stuff in it. And he went into the room, and the chap behind the desk said, well, what's that bag? And he said, well, it's my stuff. So why have you got the bag? He said, well, you're going to send me somewhere else, aren't you? And he said, don't be daft, this is your home, you're staying here. And he said that changed his life. And then he became, as an adult, he became the government's social care advisor. You know, it was just a little word of commitment from somebody, you know, can make the world of difference.
Does it not strike you as odd? It sometimes strikes me this way, that we have a society which is ostensibly very caring, and you hear nothing but caring statements from politicians of all stripes, and yet the drift of society seems to be in a negative direction in so many ways, so that criminality, for instance, is increasing. If you look at the statistics I've seen some statistics yesterday about mental health of children and the deterioration in that. So for all the efforts of the state and the establishment, if you like, by which I include the media and all the superstructure of government, despite all these efforts, in fact, to many of us, the country seems to be on the wrong path.
Well, it is on the wrong path, and it is the culture. And there is an acceptance that the sort of liberal freedom is good for everybody. And so one has to stand up and fight. I think in one little expression I've sort of cottoned on to recently, which I've heard a lot when it comes to children, and it's we must see the world through the eyes of the child, it says, right? And it sounds terribly virtuous, that, you know, and basically it's this culture of liberal individualism. It's where the state takes over more and more everybody, but particularly children. So I mean, just as an aside, I'm involved in some school in South London, and certainly involved with other schools as well, but where there's this encroachment of the state through the education system to take over the responsibilities of the family, that it's a school that does it, gives them breakfasts and things like this, and work, holidays and activities. And I said something the other day, I said, okay, and I looked back at my own child and I said, let's look through the eyes of a child, all right? What have you got? You've got a blank screen there, right? You've got maybe you've got a hill, or you've got a building, or you've got, TV or something like that. But actually what's important is the people. And you've got people coming into that vision and going out of it. And some people are there a lot of the time, and some people are very important to you and you're comforted by them being there because they look after you. And other times you can see that maybe you've got two people and they hurt each other. And what's that doing to you? And sometimes one of them hurts you. As you're seeing people, and particularly the people who you're living with, who you're with, etc., the whole time. That's what the eyes of a child sees. So and you can see one person, maybe it's your mum, there's no dad. You just see the mum. And so let's look through the eyes of a child. What's good for that child? What's good for it is that it has a dad as well.
Yeah.
And so let's properly look through the eyes of a child instead of this sort of virtue signaling, idea that saying these lovely things and then carrying on individualizing and state taking over all these family responsibilities. It's what's needed is actually a father to help mum and vice versa, two of them together. You've got a far better chance of a stable, loving, committed, lifelong relationships, which then are not only good for them, they're good for the local community, good for the nation. Stable families are, and we don't have them, and then we wonder why society is mental health. I mean, mental health, you've got your smartphone, you've got pornography on it for children,
Yes. These are very, very pernicious and evil influences on children. Looking at your career as I was before we did this interview, so I see a successful business career. I see a committed Christian life also, which you've been describing in very candid detail. There's also a political side to your life. You've been in politics and are a conservative. So here's a question: does your conservatism come from your Christianity, or is it your Christianity that leads you to conservatism? Is there actually, or what actually in your view, or is there in your view, a link between those two things?
Well, to begin with, I'd step back and say you have to take what's there. All right? So you've got Conservatives, Labour, Liberal. All right? If you're going to influence, you've got to, in a way, camp in one of them. and the Conservatives are the one who have the record of being the family-friendly ones, of being, the name it says, a conservative. So you've got the old values. So, I mean, when I actually made quite a lot of money and realised that, one could support various things and other things, but also, one could try and do some good. And in fact, that was when I came across Dr. Callum, because she, for the Centre for Social Justice, actually wrote this Breakdown Britain report in about 2007, which was Ian Duncan Smith's Centre for Social Justice. And I read that, and I was sort of helping to fund them a bit. And then they did a follow-on review, Breakthrough Britain. And this was all centred on family breakdown. And in those days, figures are pretty horrific. even worse today, I think. And so that sort of fired me up, and I was getting on, and the various things, I was on the theological college council and various trusts and everything else, and a lot of them said, you know, at 70 you've got to back off and, you know, go and put your feet up and have a holiday or something. And I always used to say, well, I searched the scriptures for this verse that says, "Thou shalt retire," and I couldn't find one. And then anyway, I was involved with the Conservative Party, and I was, you know, and I thought, well, Cameron, here's a chance, and so I started supporting him. I was one of the early supporters of Cameron, actually, and he would admit that in 2007 or something like that. And he said to me when I first met him, he said, "Well, what's your thing, Michael?" And I said, "Well, my thing is families, you know." And he then said, "Oh, well, you know, families to Labour are three people who share a fridge." And I thought, you know, some script writer's written that one for you. And, anyway.
Bit glib.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, they, you know, I talked to them about families and break down Britain, break through Britain, what the Centre for Social Justice, Ian Duncan Smith, was recommending, etc. So, you know, I supported them, and they got the coalition in 2010, and you know, and he was saying family, 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 and so I was supporting them. Anyway, they made me treasurer, and you know, but I was still, you know, pushing for that the whole time, and then, I mean, he gave me a peerage, or I was given a peerage by the Queen in 2014, and then I gave up being treasurer thereafter, because being treasurer restricts what you can say. Actually, you know, you're there.
No, of course, you're a party man.
You're a party man raising funds.
Sure.
And I think we had a clean term while I was there, which I think people were thankful for. But when I was given a peerage and I gave up being treasurer, I just thought, I can speak. I can speak. I can open my mouth. And then, you know, one prayed about it, and I realised going into Lords, I mean, it's very intimidating, really, particularly if you've been a trader and you haven't got a clue of the, you know, the etiquette, the protocols, the ways and means, the various rules. So actually, that was where, having got to know Dr. Callan, then I don't know whether happily, but she agreed to be my parliamentary advisor. Having worked in the city, I had the funds to be able to do that, and it meant that I could do something useful. Because otherwise, and my advice to other peers coming in late in life, and particularly if they've been involved as donors or something, you know, or treasurers, you know, get some help. You won't do anything unless you get some help. I mean, it's a very difficult place. But once you start to know the rules, because otherwise if you stand up at the wrong time, you start saying things at the wrong, you know. Yeah. I mean, the hallmark of the Lords is courtesy, and I very much appreciate that. And I have a lot of good things to say about the Lords. I think that as the depth of debates is very good. It's the one place in the country where you can have deep debates about some of these subjects without people shouting at each other, you know. So that was where I thought, well, you know, what do I do while I'm here? And there's a verse in Psalm 90 written by Moses. Lord, teach me to number my days that I may have a heart of wisdom. And at this age, you number each day and you value it. And actually the second half of that psalm basically says, Lord, can you give me work to do? And can you give me joy and gladness in my heart as I do it? And I thought, well, that's just a wonderful prayer. Every morning, Lord, can you give me work to do? And can I have joy and gladness? It's probably why I'm speaking to you.
Tell me this, do politicians disappoint you? Does the Tory party disappoint you? Has it disappointed
Robin, you know what the gospel says, we're all fallen. And one has to have that at the back of one's mind. And I'm thankful that it is, because it's through grace, and through faith. The most important thing for politicians is actually to know the Lord. And there are quite a number of politicians in Parliament, both houses. I'm in Bible studies with some of them, of all parties, and it's lovely to see. It's only a few, but
what would you think would be the... you're right, actually, and it's always a bit of a surprise, I think, actually, to people when they realise, when they find out that certain politicians are religious. I mean, what percentage of Parliament would you think? A small percentage?
It is a small percentage. I think having a living faith is a small percentage.
Yes.
I think there may be quite a few. There used to be, my old minister used to call it the English folk religion, where, which the sort of Anglicanism, Easter and Christmas and that sort of thing is, I think there's a lot of that there, which in itself is much better than nothing.
Yes.
Because it is, again, the basis of those values of, you love your neighbour and you forgive your enemy and you work for the common good. Those are Christian imperatives almost, encouragements. Looking
just to the immediate future, I mean, the next battle, or one of the next battles, I think is going to be over the idea of assisted dying. And in my lifetime, so I was born in the early 1950s, it seems that liberals have won every battle along the way. So on pornography, on abortion, on divorce, on sexual morality generally, everything has become freer and easier and more liberal. And I think the reformers, those who call themselves progressive, have their eye now on euthanasia. Does that figure in your...
Yeah.
Is that on your radar?
Yeah. Just to start with, it's interesting how the choice of words that people use to describe themselves. This word progressive, it's actually, in almost all areas, I think it's regressive. But if you call yourself progressive and shut down conversation after that, then you're automatically saying we're good people moving forward. Well, actually, you're moving forward into darkness, frankly. Well, I'm a Christian. I believe in the Lord. There is. Our Lord said there'll be wars. There'll be rumors of wars. There'll be famines. There'll be persecutions. And he said that over 2,000 years ago, and we've lived in the Christian era, as they call it, ever since. And we've had wars and rumors of wars. Human nature doesn't change, and certainly the lies, if you like, that grow up. I mean, it's interesting. I was talking to somebody early this morning about Germany in the mid 1800s and the rise of liberal Christianity, the deconstruction of the Bible. They're saying, well, yeah, we can believe this, we can do it, but actually you can't believe this miracle because miracles don't really happen. And so in the end, you sort of denigrate the whole thing. And so if you look at the decline of Christianity in Germany during that period of time, the second half, you came down to, what's his name, the famous marshal, whatever, I forget it now, before Kaiser Wilhelm. But it was descending down away from Christianity, and then of course it built up to Nazism,
yes,
where the Christians were very, very few and far between. Bonhoeffer, people like that, and the Lord, in the New Testament it says God gives people up to what they want. So what I would say is, that I think the pendulum's swinging back. A couple of answers here. People are opening their mouths. Assisted suicide, it's like pornography on the internet. One of my main arguments, and I've said this to Baroness Burton, you have to leave open this review for new research, for new data. And assisted suicide, we're getting increasing amounts of data from the places that actually allow it, Canada, Oregon, all these places. And I mean, Canada, it's now, I think, the fifth cause of death. Mm-hmm. And, the questions are arising, etc. And the data is increasingly negative. And the whole area of motive, of why, wills and things like that. I mean, this Parliament rejected it last time. They are pushing for it to come through again. I'm sure private members' bill will pop up sooner or later. Like we've got private members' bill on conversion therapy coming up tomorrow, actually in the Lords. But in fact, I think there'll be quite a good debate. But I think the argument against conversion therapy as it's put forward in this bill will be quite strong and powerful. So people are standing up. People are starting to speak. It's people. More and more people are starting to see the things which are negative, which are bad for society, and then more and more people hopefully will have courage and stand up with the few that are standing up already.
I think I would agree with that in the sense that I think that resistance to what you might call the liberal hegemony, the idea that particularly the hegemony of liberal intellectuals in public life is being challenged in a way that it wasn't, say, 20 years ago. So that is true. But are you then an optimist? Do you sit here and say that you see, I mean, you say the pendulum swings, undoubtedly it does. Do you think that it's swinging back our way?
Well, Robin, again, the Lord says you'll always have these things. I'm not sure. It may be that the Christians in this country will still go through a tougher time of persecution than, because we will be the ones standing up. I am heartened by the number of churches which are filling up with young people, funnily enough. You never see it, you never hear it, but I see it and hear it because one's involved with Christian communities. And the other point I'll make is that, teach me to number my days. We really don't have many days here. We put an awful lot of effort into making what's here is right, which is good. But the parliamentarians we all sort of talk and work as if we're here forever. Well, we're not. I mean, the House of Lords, they always say, well, it's very crowded and it's got too many people. You shouldn't appoint so many. I said, well, you're not seeing how many are leaving. And I said, the exit door. And for almost every other day we get the Lord Speaker saying, "I regret we have to advise that so-and-so's died." I'm, as a Christian, I'm aware that, what I call the lies of Satan and the idols of men, they abound, and they proliferate wherever we turn our back on the Lord. But the Lord is still the Lord, and he hasn't taken his hand off this planet. The gospel is still going out to weird places like Iran and depths of China and all sorts of other places. You hear in South America, really, vibrant churches. Africa's going to be the country, the continent which is going to have the one population, could be described as the continent of the 21st century, which none of us were sort of expecting, but there's a lot of Christians there, and so life is as it has always been, but that doesn't mean to say you're a fatalist and just will give up. We're encouraged to stand up, to speak out, to try and do good, the common good, and to be unashamed of our Lord. So that's what one does, tries to do and prays to do for as many days as the Lord gives us.
If you've enjoyed watching this interview, and I hope you have, and you'd like to see more of this kind of work, you might care to consider making a small donation. If you go to our website, newhumanum.org, and follow the links, you'll find a donation page. Anything you can give us would be gratefully received.